Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I've been asking around, or rather watching a lot of other YouTubers, and I think that there's one thing stopping me from being labeled a productivity guru, and that's to release a video on the Feynman Technique. So that's exactly what I'm going to do today. I'm going to walk through my process of using the Feynman Technique to take technical notes. Richard Feynman was an American theoretical physicist who won the Nobel Prize in 1965 in physics, of course. He was often called the Great Explainer because he was known for his ability to break down complex ideas, not only in a way that made people or helped people understand, but made them interested in what it was that he was talking about. He was a very entertaining speaker, and you can see that in a lot of his lectures that are on YouTube. One of the many gems that Feynman developed over his lifetime was a learning technique aptly named the Feynman Technique. The Feynman Technique is a four-step process that goes as follows. Step 1, you select an area of interest or concept that you want to learn, and then you go out and learn about that particular area of interest or concept. And that entails, reading books, reading articles, watching YouTube videos, or doing video courses. And then optionally, you take notes along the way. But those notes would be very useful when you get to step 2. So step 2 of the Feynman Technique is you write down everything that you know on a sheet of paper, maybe an Obsidian note or a Logseq note. And the aim or the goal with this exercise of step 2 is to identify the gaps in your understanding. So as you're forced to write out what you think you understand, you will inherently find where you do not understand. And when you encounter that, which for me is rather frequently, you go back to the literature that you consumed and try and fill that gap of knowledge. Now, after you've done this for a number of pieces of literature, video course, or book, you'll have several different notes of the topic at different levels that address different areas inside that area of knowledge. And that's where step 3 comes in. So step 3 is to simplify and organize. So you take all those different notes that you've taken to try and fill in your gaps, and you start to reorganize them in a narrative that would help someone else learn. So this reminds me of the Smart Notes. So Smart Notes are always supposed to be written in a way that others can understand. Step 3 of the Feynman Technique is very similar, except for you're reorganizing several pieces of literature notes into one particular body or knowledge structure in step 3. So after you finish step 3, the final step is to publish it, because it's hard for you to identify the gaps in that, or where you failed to communicate. Maybe you do have the knowledge, but you might not be able to articulate it in a very valuable way, or as best you could. And that's where step 4, the publishing, comes into play, where you put it out there, whether you show it to a colleague or you put it online in the shape of a YouTube video or a blog post or whatever. But that allows you, it gives you the opportunity to receive that feedback to further improve your understanding. And then this is just kind of a continuous cycle that continues on with either deepening a particular area of interest or as you approach a new area of interest. And so that's, in a nutshell, the Feynman Technique. Now what I'm going to show you on screen is how I use that in Logseq and Obsidian to take technical notes. Everyone loves an Obsidian graph, so here's mine for Go, the Go programming language. Last August, I accepted an opportunity to switch my focus from DevOps tools that manage infrastructure as code, mainly Terraform and Ansible on Azure, to Go on Azure. My decade-plus experience in tech has been infrastructure focused, so when I dove fully into software development, I felt a little bit like I was drowning. Using step 1 of the Feynman Technique, I narrowed my focus to learning the language and syntax of Go. And as a result, I've read a number of blog posts and articles, as well as a few books and watched a few courses, all of which has resulted in the knowledge-based graph that you're looking at right here. But how did I build it? In his book, The 4-Hour Chef, Tim Ferriss lays out how he learned Japanese at the age of 15, largely in part by studying a single piece of paper that contained 1,945 of the characters that were required for basic literacy in the language. He shares the story to make the point that the material that you study from beats the method that you study with. And for that reason, I invest a significant amount of effort in selecting the proper material before I begin step 2 of the Feynman Technique, which is to consume the information and to take notes as you go and to fill your knowledge, just as a recap. To do that, I ask colleagues and friends for references, and I feel no guilt or shame for buying a book, skimming it, or superficially reading it and putting it aside if it's not what I'm looking for, if it's not really helping me fill the gaps that I need, or if it's just too much information for me to consume at that time, and there might be a better resource out there. I try to avoid sunk costs at all costs. And if you want me to share how I do that, please let me know in the comments, and I'd be happy to do a video on how I do superficial reading and skimming, systematic skimming. So once a resource has been selected, I create a note for it inside of Logseq, and I update my time block template to include a daily metric to dedicate at least 30 minutes to it. That way I can, make sure that I'm reminded to spend the 30 minutes investing in the resource. I also, if it's a physical book, I have it on my desk somewhere to remind me, all sorts of environmental cues just to remind me that I want to make that investment. And I've already, spent a significant amount of time, so I have some sunk cost in the selection of the material to actually follow through with reading it. So to start, what the template looks like, and I've covered time blocking in a different video, but this is the template. So every day, my journal entry in Logseq gets populated by this template. And what I'll do for the duration of a book or a course, something that's going to take me more than a day to read or to watch, I come in here and I have one of my daily metrics. So one of my daily metrics is to learn Go. You can see that here in the highlighted box. And I want to invest at least 30 minutes in there. Most of the time, I can sneak another 15 minutes, maybe another 30. And then I include a link to the note for that particular thing. So right now, at the time of this recording, I'm actually in this O'Reilly Interactive Camp, I believe is what it's called, and it's called Go in 3 weeks. It's phenomenal. It's really great. But that's just once a week. But that's I'm going through the material every day and trying to fill my knowledge in as best I can with that course. But typically, this will be where I put the note. So if we go back to my previous note that I have for the recording of this video, I'll have a couple other examples. So I have an article example, I have a book example, and a course example. Now, again, these notes are for me to use while I'm consuming the information and then taking notes to fill the gaps in my understanding. So I'm collecting what's interesting. I'm collecting where I fail to understand, and then I go back to the material and I fill in the notes. This is very much like a literature note if you're following the Smart Notes methodology. So let's start with a more simple example, which would be the article. So there was this DigitalOcean article that I found really useful in learning maps in Go. And typically what I'll do is I'll include the source. So that way it's just easy. If I'm using this in my planner, I can open this note and then I can click this link. I don't need to keep tabs open in my browser. Part of my shutdown ritual is to close all the windows on my computer and to shut down my computer fully. And so it's a better place for me to keep the URL. So I have the source at the top, and then it's really just a scratch space. So I try to treat this note no different than if I were going to a lecture or if I were going to a class in college and I had this physical notebook and I'm just rapid logging all the things that I found useful. Digital notes are particularly useful for technical notes because syntax. It's very difficult to write out all the syntax, and it feels weird to write syntax on paper, because everything in a programming language is in a computer. It doesn't do any good on physical paper. So I really like taking digital notes, especially for technical learning, technology. So you can see here, I think at the beginning, it's kind of loose. I've just got some basic introductory stuff from probably the beginning part. And so you'll be able to match, like the top of this note is going to be the top of the article, so to speak. But then I got a little bit more organized as I went through the article, because there's a section called Check Key Maps. And so I made a heading for that. Again, this is all just markdown driven, so you can see that. And then I've started to chunk up the article by the different pieces or the headings inside there. So you'll see that pattern a lot as we go through here. Is I'll take the headings of whatever the material was and I'll copy them in here as a way to organize my note a little bit. And really, I'm just trying to capture what I found interesting or examples of stuff, so that way I can reference. And then here's actually the sample code of a function that I wrote as a result of reading this article. And it's not that long. So here's where I capture all of this particular information from the resource that I consumed. Again, this is very similar to a literature note if you're familiar with the Smart Notes methodology. I've got a whole playlist on that if you're interested. So that is an article. If we go back, we can take a look at a book. So the book is organized a little bit differently. There's obviously a lot more information in the book. This book is titled Introducing Go. It's a fantastic resource for beginners. It does not assume that you have a CS degree or have been coding for a number of years, and so forth. Oh, one little interesting thing. Because I'm using these notes to link in my daily planner, you can see all the days that I was reading this book. So I started it on February 10th, and I finished it on March 28th, it looks like. And that's when I was moving it into Obsidian. So I probably was done reading around this time frame, March 4th. And that's an interesting thing to highlight. So as I take these notes, I write them in here and then I leave them for a while. This is a tip that I got from Ryan Holiday and Robert Greene, is what they'll do is they'll read a book and they'll mark it up. They'll make all sorts of highlights in it, and then they'll set it back on the shelf, and they'll let it kind of like marinate, so to speak, and age. So they let that knowledge age, then they pull it off the shelf in a couple weeks. For me, it looks like it was, close to 3 weeks, 2.5, 3 weeks. And then I pulled it up and I said, okay, I'm going to review the notes I took, and I'm going to translate them into the knowledge base notes, which we'll talk about in a minute. But here you can see that I don't have just one massive page with all the notes for the book. I have the book kind of broken up into chapters. Now, if I were to do this again, I probably wouldn't create a note for each of the chapters. I would probably just create a bullet and have them in there underneath like an H2 or something, much like I did with the tutorial note where I had just the H2 of whatever the section was. I might do an H2 for a chapter, if that makes sense. But I'm not going to change it. Again, these are just, I call them digital notebooks. One thing to note up here, I do have some tags. So this is how you define a tag. And this is a notebook and then Golang. So that way I can, my idea is that way, once I've read, 5 or 10 books, it might be difficult to remember all the names. And so I can use the tags to find my way back to all the books. But if we go into control structures, this is basically the literature note version for the chapter of the book. So in here, I found 3 main things: useful or interesting, which is the for statement. And if we expand that, you can see my notes on there. And then the if else, and they're basically just examples or what I found interesting. So this is a really interesting point for Go, which is unlike other languages that have many different types of loops, the while, do, and tell. Go just has the for loop, and that was very interesting and important for the language to understand. So I wrote that down as a note, and that'll probably make its way into Obsidian as a permanent note or as a knowledge base note. So again, it's really kind of the same. I'm just using this as a dumping ground or a scratch space, and then I'm organizing it by most likely the headings or the examples that I found most interesting. And then I also use this as a way to do all the exercises. So, don't be afraid to throw in anything else that's related to this. If you found an article that was relevant to control structures that the book reference that's useful, I would throw it in here as well. And if we go and look at a couple other chapters like functions, I think I took a lot of notes. And I bold specific keywords. And this is all my attempt to come to terms with the author. So that's a term from How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. And so what your goal is with analytical reading is you want to find the key terms that an author is using, and then you want to define them. It's relatively easy in technical books because they're, especially in a programming book, because they're aspects of the language, the key terms are. So this sporadic functions is a key term that I bolded there and then gave an example to. I still don't fully understand them, but at least that's a start. And then function closures and stuff like that is down here in recursion. And I wrote my own example. In the book, they did some kind of weird math problem. And I was like, the only way I understand recursion is if I just parse the file system. So that's what I did. I ended up writing an example for that. But yeah, there's the main points. I won't belabor it too much. And then I also try to use different elements of Markdown to highlight different types of things. So you can see here that I'm using a quote block with this greater than sign. And that's to call out specific ideas in the book, or if there's a quote that really stuck out with me. So these are actual verbatim quotes from the book that I wanted to capture and include in the knowledge base somewhere. And then you saw up above where I used bold for something, and then also highlighting is a feature. So if you do the double equal sign on each side, you could do that. So functional programming sounds cool. It's not something that I understand at all. And programming needs an O, probably. But it's something to look up, and it's something to look up in the future, and that's why I highlighted it. So don't be afraid to use some of the different elements inside here. I also use tasks lists or tasks in here in Logseq to remind me to do something. So this, you can see the note where I just explained they had some kind of weird math problem that did recursion. I didn't understand that, and I wanted to get the rep of going through and writing the code. So I put a little to-do in here that reminded me reminded me that I wanted to do this exercise, and I just skip it. And actually how this showed up in my time blocker is I basically right-clicked here and did copy reference block, and then I put it into my template, and then my template then has a link directly back to this position in my note. So it's a really great way to connect and pick up where you left off. So that's functions. We can look at testing, I guess, just another example. So not everything, every chapter was super mind-blowing. testing was something that was like a little bit beyond my grasp. And so I just took very light notes, and it was very light in the book. So if you don't understand something, you're going to take a lot more notes. In this case, there wasn't a lot to understand. It was very introductory knowledge and testing. And so my notes were very weak in that area, but functions, as you saw, was very expansive. So that's a book example. And now we'll take a look at a course. So Ultimate Syntax is a great course. Again, I put the link. If there's any kind of a URL link, I definitely include that in the note. I added some tags. It's a course. It's Golang. And then in here, I began to start to use something called the TOC. And so each of these bold, or H3s rather, each of these H3s do correlate to a clip inside the module. So, like a 5-minute video or whatever it was. So that way, if I needed to, I could go back. If I was rereading this, I didn't fully understand, I at least knew what clip to look at instead of, just this long string of text for all the group, all the clips and notes. And you can see here that I'm starting to find links. So there was a Go Playground link, and then there was actually a link to a GitHub repository for this one. So that was relevant information for that. Highlighting key points again, using the backtick or the tilde to call out specific syntax, using code blocks to display examples. Type pollution, that's probably worthy of a highlight because that's a key term, or rather a bold. We'll do a bold because that's definitely something I want to understand as a term, so that way I can use it properly, etc. But you can see it's very much the same. And I even do good and bad examples. They laid that out in there of what Go's kind promotion does. And this is a good example of how to use it. And this is a bad example. And I love this particular comment. So this is another YouTuber. I'll put a link to the video because it's Donovan Codes or something like that as a channel. But he made the point that you should not take notes. I'm making the point that you should, but I loved one point that he said is if you're going to take notes, the minimalist approach would be to put comments in your code. And I love that idea because now it's easier for me to take this snippet and move it into the vault and kind of eliminate and simplify it a little bit. So if you finish scrolling up here, you can see again, highlights, code snippets. It's more or less the same. The general idea is this should be your scratch space where you're just taking all of your notes, rapid log, and brain dumping everything that you're learning here. You're not worried about capturing every single thing that's said. You're capturing what's interesting or the gaps in your knowledge. The main point of the Feynman technique is to find your gaps. And just so happens that I have a little tag here that I use for gap, like enumerators. I just don't understand that yet. And so I put a little gap tag here. I should probably change that to a highlight because it makes it a little bit more visible. But you'll be able to see that gap in my knowledge base too. So that's pretty much it for the different types of notes. Again, I do this for any article that I deem necessary or book or course. I don't do this for every single thing, so just keep that in mind. Like there's a significant time investment and effort that goes into these notes, and there's going to be even more effort in this third step of simplifying and reorganizing inside Obsidian. And so I don't do this for every single thing. Sometimes what will happen is I'll read an article and I'll have a little bit of a takeaway, or I'll run into a bug and I'll have a solution that I can take away, and I will just create a note inside the vault and skip the Logseq step. This is more for really literature that I just need some more time and effort to consume whatever it is. And again, that's why they titled this talk The Slow Learning, because this is definitely a slower approach versus just consuming a bunch of stuff, taking some, working through some code examples and then throwing up a project. I really want to understand the language, and I'm taking my time to go through it. And I also want to build a knowledge base that kind of solidifies all that knowledge, very much like Feynman had all these notebooks around physics and different things inside that realm. That he would really refine his understanding, and that's what made him become such a fantastic speaker, or one of the elements, right, is that his understanding was so deep that he could communicate to almost anyone these complex ideas. So that pretty much wraps it up for Logseq. Now we'll switch back to Obsidian, and I'll kind of do a split screen where I have Logseq and then I have Obsidian, and I'll show you how I created some of the notes in there. So here we are, we have Obsidian on the left-hand side, and we have Logseq on the right-hand side, and this is the third step of the Feynman technique, which is to simplify and reorganize. The best way to think about this step is the integration of knowledge. So for example, I've got the Introducing Go book, and that had a chapter on maps, or a section on maps, and then I read this article on maps. Now how do I get the knowledge that I acquired from both together in an integrated place where I can, one, reference in the future, but also kind of merge my understanding and use some integrative thinking to combine that knowledge. And that's the purpose of this step 3 of the Feynman technique, simplify and reorganize. Now, how I execute this, or how I do this, is I open up my Logseq note and I kind of scan through here of what's important, the main points that I would want to remember, or that would be in addition to my knowledge base. Now, typically, if I don't have a knowledge structure or folder where this would go into, it's not integrating into existing knowledge, it's more kind of laying the foundation for a new one. What I do is I create it outside of my knowledge base. So you can see that I have 1 projects, 2 knowledge base, 3 reference, and 4 archive, and then I have some attachments and templates. So what I'll do is I'll create a folder in the root of Obsidian, in the root of the vault, and that's where I'll just start to put all my notes. So what I'll do, if you look here, is I have another folder for create map, and how I'm doing this is using a plugin called folder note. So my folders are notes, pretty simple. So inside this folder, create a map, there is a file called createamap.md, and it just kind of maps them together, so that way I can see it. So if you look at create a map, this actually is a note that has a link to another note. And if you look, this is very similar, actually identical to this. So I kind of compressed some of the knowledge of maps and made it a comment inside this example of how to do this. And I actually reference this quite a bit when I'm trying to think, okay, what is the syntax? It's not muscle memory yet for defining a map. So I'll come in here, I'll grab this as a code snippet. I could probably turn it into a VS Code snippet, but I'm too lazy. But that is what I do. And then down here, I have kind of like a quote, right? So I coalesce this, mainly kind of copy and pasted this, it looks like, to this quote block here. And then I created another one. So create a map of multiple types. This came from a different article, but you can see that's where the integration comes from. But let's put that aside. Let's just assume that I'm extracting all the knowledge from this particular note here. So check key maps. That became a note here. So that entire heading got compressed down into this note. So Go does not distinguish between 0 types and missing keys. It will give you a 0 key value if it's missing. That was kind of a key point when you're checking for values. I thought it was important. And then again, there's the syntax, right? So I'm just kind of copying what I found was most useful snippet, and I put it in here, and then I add some supporting text. Now I would probably move this into some comments so it's a little bit more relevant in there. And then delete a map, same thing. Here's how you delete. Then you get the delete keyword, and then you can clear all map values by declaring a blank interface or an empty map of the same type. So essentially what I do is I go through here and I have add or change maps too. So that's another one. I just go through my note and I move them in. And again, I'm simplifying and I'm reorganizing. So I went through here and I threw all these in to a single maps directory. And then I found, oh, I have a couple notes on creating a map. So I'm going to create a map a folder. And then I just start to morph it like clay. So as I get more knowledge in that space, the folder structure starts to get deeper. But it all starts at a flat level. And this is another tip that I got from Ryan Holiday and Robert Greene, is where when they're writing a book, what they'll do is they'll basically find the sections, like the very rough structure of the book, like part 1, part 2, huge ideas. And then they start just researching and reading and taking notes, very much like that I'm doing here. And they dump them into the parts. So I knew that all of these notes would be about maps. So I'm reviewing my literature notes on maps. I'm just taking those notes and putting them into a map folder because that's the part or the structure that they belong in. And then as I take notes, I start to find patterns that emerge in there. So I have create a map. Oh, there's a couple notes there. I'll create a folder around that. Now I could probably do the same thing with add or change and access keys. They're very similar. So I could create a keyword for that. So create a map is a keyword. That folder is a keyword. And then I move additional notes into that to build its knowledge structure, very much like a sequence would start to develop in a Smart Notes Zettelkasten method. So that's that. Now, the final step is, once I've kind of extracted out all the knowledge that I can get from this particular example, I put it in here. Now, before I move on, I want to show one thing. If I scroll down here, let's review this for a second. So how I turn this into something useful is by embedding it. So if you look at here, I'm using this exclamation mark with the double brackets. So it's not just linked, I'm actually able to see the note. And the reason I did this is because I wanted to mirror what a physical slipbox or knowledge base would look like, where I could basically pull out maps and then I could lay them on my desk and I could see the notes. And that's what I wanted to emulate here, so I could kind of thumb through the knowledge base, so to speak. So if I click on maps, I open up this folder note, and if I click on here, I get to navigate by my folder structure. But if you look at the top level note, how this ties all of them together is if I scroll through here, I can see that every single note that is in this top level is a link that's embedded here. So create a map is a link that I could click, and that would bring me to that with its additional note. But I can also just hover over here and see its embedded note, the one that's linked directly to create a map. I can see my access key maps. And so this makes it really easy for me to scan and to dive and zoom in to particular areas of my knowledge base. If I keep scrolling, you can see that I have my samples. There's the delete a map. And then I have a sample. So you notice here that I had this code sample that had all this kind of in one executable code. This is something that's very handy with Obsidian, is I can actually attach scripts. So I have a code repo with a bunch of sample scripts, and I basically just attach this. So if I click this, it will open VS Code. And so then I have kind of an executable function or app at my disposal if I want to, straight from my knowledge base. But I go through this process, just kind of reiterate, this is step 3 again, simplify and reorganize. I review my step 2 note. I pull that knowledge into different note cards, give the note cards a name. Often I will cite the source. I didn't do it in this case. This is all coming from this article from DigitalOcean. And then I create folder structures when necessary if there's a theme that kind of emerges. And then the final step for me is to reorganize. So inside my knowledge base, I have a lot of existing notes, and a map, because I've been learning about this in the Introducing Go book, is a data structure. So what I would do for maps, now that I've kind of created this little nugget of knowledge around maps, is I would take this folder and I'd move it into data structures. And so if you see data structures, now I have notes on arrays and types all around data structures. Types might not even fit in data structures, but I can move it around as my knowledge expands. Right now it kind of fits in a data structure because you would define a type with structs and stuff, and you can make your own types, etc. So that's why it's there. And if I browse through here, I can kind of see it coalesce. Now, how I link to this is I create a folder note for data structures, and then I just have a link to maps because there's a lot of knowledge here. This is all cool and dandy, but where does this begin to pay off? Well, one of the areas, aside from the benefit of integrating the knowledge and being able to reference this, which I do rather frequently, is the first place that I go now when I need a code snippet or I need to understand something a little bit better. If I'm writing about it, so to speak, I come into my knowledge base and I look at my own notes, and then I kind of spider out from there with the links and sources and stuff. But another area that is super useful, if you didn't catch it in the beginning, I have 2 different tags labeled in here. So the red one is for the language, the topic itself, which is Golang. That's the name of the folder there. But I also have these orangish yellow ones scattered out. And these are actually gaps that I've identified in my knowledge, things that I know that I don't understand very well. And if we look at something like pointers, you can see that I have this tag of gap. So now what I can do with this particular thing, if I'm looking at my knowledge base, it's telling me where I'm weak. It's telling me where I need to invest more of my time. And this is a great indicator for me, and it has a lot of utility and use because now I can use syntopical reading. So in How to Read a Book, Mortimer Adler talks about this last stage of reading, which is syntopical reading, where you inspect, so you either systematically skim or superficially read a piece of literature, and then you only analytically read sections of it across many different artifacts. So I could take now this knowledge and lay out maybe 5 or 6 books or courses or articles and say, okay, I only need to really focus in on things that talk about closure functions or interfaces or methods or pointers. And I can go and do that. And I actually just started to do this with a book, Go in Action, which is a fantastic book another book that I've been reading for Go. But I realized that instead of kind of suffering through or treasuring through the beginning of the book, which I already know, I've got a good idea of variables, and I've got a very good idea of functions, right? Because I've taken a lot of notes on them, and that knowledge base is pretty filled out. But there's also chapter 5 in there, which talks about the type structure, and that is a huge gap for me because that's a new concept for me to learn about, which is the strictly typed nature of Go. And so I can read that chapter and get the most from the book and not have to feel like I need to consume the entire thing. So that's another way that this knowledge base pays off. Now, the final step of the Feynman technique, publish, is the 4th step. Arguably, I have not done any of that publishing. Maybe this video is a form of that. One idea that I do have is to maybe publish this vault with Obsidian's published, so that way people could browse this and review my own notes. Maybe that's a way. Or I could take my code samples that this has created and maybe make a GitHub repo out of it. I'm still not sure what that outlet looks for me, because I'm still very much in the beginning phases of learning. One thing that's very interesting, though, there's a similarity here between the end result of Smart Notes and the end result of the Feynman Technique. So if you look at the folder structure here, I was showing this to a colleague, and they kind of paused for a minute and they asked, like, "Are you going to write a Go book?" And I was like, I don't know. Why do you say that? And it was because my notes are starting to outline a manuscript. And that is the same thing, kind of the output of the Smart Notes is it will create eventually this particular folder structure that would make it really easy to produce a book. So if you do so to choose, it's a long road and a hard task to do. So I'm not fully committed to that yet, but it's interesting that I'm basically doing all the legwork day by day instead of like deciding to write a book and then trudging through all the tasks and trying to remember and recall and organize. I'm kind of doing that as I go. So maybe a natural consequence of building out this specific knowledge base will be a Go book in the future. I don't know. I'm not committing myself to that. But it's interesting that the notes kind of organize themselves in a way that lends them to doing that. Or whatever else. I could choose to do YouTube videos, or I could choose to do something that isn't a book. That's just one particular outlet, maybe video course or something like that. Again, not committing to that. I'm learning this for work and to get into a new discipline, which is software engineering. And this is how I'm going about doing it, and using the Feynman technique for slow learning that is fast learning, because I'm learning at a much deeper level than I ever had before. And with that, I'll wrap up this video. It's a little bit longer than most of my videos, but I hope this was useful. If you want to see a more detailed process of me taking a new note and actually walking through the process of taking the literature note or the step 2 note and moving it into the knowledge base, let me know in the comments. I'll be happy to take a more real-time approach of that instead of kind of looking at it after the fact. So yeah, let me know for sure in the comments. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you consider hitting the like button and smashing subscribe. Bob, if you're listening, that was for you. I told myself I'd never say that, but I'll do it one time just for you. For everybody else, thank you again for watching. Hope this was informative. Hope you took something away. If you have any questions around this crazy thing that I've created here, please let me know in the comments.